Now back to the show. This is The Law Show on CL 650.
God, I want you to be careful how you vote, y'all. Well, on every election day.
Well, there you go. A note of caution. Be careful how you vote there. It's The Law Show here on CIL 650. We have our guests from MKS Law, Rudy Kisher, Alex Stojkovic, immigration and citizenship lawyers in Vancouver. We're talking a little politics this morning because, of course, one of the longest election campaigns in the history of Canada is underway. We talked a little bit in our first segment about the government, the Conservative Party, and what they've done in the 9 years that they have enjoyed power in this country, many of them as a majority, where you really get things done. And we've talked about why they've made the changes they have. Alex, we talked about express entry and some of the rather small numbers that program is showing so far as it is in its initial stages. But we haven't heard a lot from them with regards to what they would do if they were to be returned again as a government. Is that deliberate? I haven't heard anything about immigration policy from the Conservatives, and I suspect that's because they're comfortable running on their record. See what we've done, vote for us, more of same guaranteed.
Yeah, I think there's no question that that's the case. The current minister is not, for lack of a better word, is more of a caretaker minister than a minister who has a change agenda.
Okay.
Certainly, he is not part of the close inner circle around the Prime Minister that the previous minister was. And nobody would dispute that the last Minister of Immigration was far more powerful a person than and had a far greater standing in cabinet than the current one.
Okay, so Chris Alexander was preceded by
Jason Kenney, the current Minister of Education and Skills Development Canada. Employment and Skills Development Canada? I can't keep that straight.
I think you're right, Employment and Skills Development Canada.
Yeah. So, you know, the Tory agenda focused on three things with immigration. It focused on levels. We need to use the current research that is telling us that economic advantage gain from economic immigrants is greater than family class immigrants.
Okay.
So we need to increase our levels of economic immigration versus humanitarian immigration, which is family class, spouses of Canadians, and refugees.
So have they done that?
And
have the numbers been changed?
Absolutely. Now 70% of our immigration comes from the economic half, versus 60 as it was under the Liberals.
Okay.
And 30% as opposed to 40% comes from family class, the humanitarian pieces like the refugee program, and spouses of Canadians being sponsored from abroad.
And Rudy, we're starting to see some rather dramatic numbers beginning. We were talking about major backlogs in our previous segment, but with the changes in the numbers and government attitude with respect to family class, now we're seeing much longer queues in that category trying to get in.
Well, if you look at family class, really breaks down into two categories. So the first category that I think everybody will associate with right away is sort of the spousal category.
Sure, of course.
So you go, you find somebody here, for example, a Canadian falls in love with a student here who's up from the United States, for example. They get married. He wants to sponsor her. There's an inland Canada process that's available to them. That process will take over 2 years.
Really?
2 years. So from a Canadian citizen marrying somebody from the United States who really isn't looking for a passport to live in colder weather and pay more taxes.
That's right.
They're going to take 2 years to process that application in Canada. That's outrageous.
Now, how long did it used to take?
Under the Liberals, there was a goal to have it done in 6 months.
Okay.
That was sort of the processing standard, which to me sounds reasonable. By the time you get the paper, I think most people can, less than 12 months, they can live with that.
Sure.
You start saying 24 months, well, maybe we should move to the States instead of here. Maybe we got to live abroad for a while because how does she keep her status in the meantime as a visitor? Is she going to be able to work? Creates all sorts of issues for newlywed couples that are trying to immigrate to Canada. Horrible. I think it should be, if this is the Conservative Party is the family party, then they should be taking care of the family. And that is, your spouse is as close as you get in family in most cases, right? The second part of the equation that I think they've really sort of snuck under the floor, snuck in through the door in terms of making a big change is if you ask them, they would probably, the Conservatives would like to close the parents and grandparents class. We are one of the few countries in the world that allow parents and grandparents.
It's us in the United States, and that's pretty much it.
And that's it. Most people don't allow people that are usually in their senior years where they're no longer paying a lot of taxes, they're not contributing a lot to the economy in sort of the regular vision of the word, and therefore, you know, it's a policy where they would like to close. And plus, if they're going to stick to a 70-30 sort of mix that they want, and you have so many spouses coming in, you don't have that much room. But instead of closing the program, they've kept it open, and now we've seen massive changes in terms of waiting times. Waiting times, when I started to practice, I mean, it's 15 years ago now, or if not longer, you know, you'd see sort of processing times of 2 years to bring a parent to grandparent, something reasonable that you could live with. Now we're seeing processing times of 15 years.
15 years.
15 years. So you can imagine you go to sponsor your grandmother at 65 or your mother at 65. Well, she's not getting here until she's 80.
If she's lucky.
Is this really a program that we're keeping around, or are we just keeping because we don't want to make the changes because there's going to be political backlash? But we can say we're still pro-immigration and pro-family immigration, you know, and they're getting criticized by this by the NDP and the Liberal government.
Right. Now, Alex, back to the Conservatives are basically advancing their immigration status or policies on three pillars.
So we have the first pillar, and the second pillar flows well with the first one to some extent, but it creates some paradoxes. And then the second one is we are not going to be seen anymore as the country that's over generous with its refugee policy and that allows too much to people that are willing to take advantage of us. And if you look at and our generosity. So if you look at that piece of the puzzle, what you have there is greatly strengthened enforcement measures.
Yes.
Much more tightening on the enforcement side, much greater investment in Canada Border Services, which is the agency that does removals, publishing of a most wanted list for immigrants who've committed crimes, trumpeting how many people get deported every year, which is probably, I would say the numbers are 300% what they were in 1995, from about 7,000 a year to this year close to 20,000 people were removed from Canada. All of those restrictions then continue on into the family class piece, where there's tightening rules on spouses of convenience and marriage fraud and marriages of convenience. There's all kinds of restrictions that were put in the last 5 years to tighten those up. And the standards for sponsoring your parent have gone up quite a bit too. You need to make far more money, and you need to be a sponsor for a lot longer. You're not sponsoring for 10 years, you're sponsoring for 20.
Right.
So these pieces have made all of the family reunification and all of the other elements here, the spouse and the refugee bits, a lot tighter. What's interesting, though, is if you've made all of this harder and you've narrowed the number of people who can actually do this, why are you making them wait that much longer? The trade-off should be that they were be processed faster, you would think. But instead, it's quite the opposite.
And yet the rationale for this, as I understand it, is basically the chump factor. In the past, we've been gamed by a lot of people, and so now we're not going to take it anymore. We're going to get tougher, and we're not going to be suckers for people who come in here and take us for a free ride.
Exactly.
I mean, if you take a look at the citizenship, is a good example of that. You know, they've tightened up. When I started to practice, I remember asking the first CBSA officer in charge of immigration, the CIC officer that came to speak to us about citizenship, and I was like, well, how do you test for language ability? I see it in here. I don't see any English test requirement.
Right, there's no text
and,
written.
And the answer I got 15 years ago, well, they show up to take the citizenship test, and if we direct them to the chair and they're able to follow those directions, and we seem that they can understand those directions, then we assume they're speaking enough English.
Okay.
And that was the test. Whereas today, they actually have to go sit a test that measures their reading, writing, speaking, and their listening ability, and they have to get a certain benchmark on those, or they're not going to be able to qualify, and they have to do that by an independent organization. So they've tightened up on that. And also, if you take a look, they've also tightened up in terms of making sure that the documentation's there. I mean, under the old system, there wasn't a lot of requirement in documentation when you were applying for citizenship. And now that they found a case that was out east, a guy had made 3,000 citizenship applications and facilitated 3,000 applications that were totally fraudulent.
This is a so-called consultant?
Not a lawyer. Because let's be clear on that.
That's right. And I'm glad you brought that point up. Alex, what's the third pillar that the Conservatives would have us believe is the the sum total of their immigration attitudes and policies.
I don't know about sum total, but processing it more efficiently. In terms of the federal budget.
But that would suit their agenda.
Sure.
Efficiency. Yeah, that would be the sum total of what they're about.
The challenge that you have is that this is one of the government departments that's large, with large budgets.
Sure.
And if you look at the overall federal budget, $300 billion or $330, 40 billion, whatever it is, the numbers are small. But if you take out, you're talking about a department with a few hundred million in terms of budget annually. But if you take out the bits of the federal budget that are transfers and everything else, and you go to the core budget for operating various parts of the government, this is one that has been attacked. This is one where they've really clamped down to try to sting into the actual operating budget of the department to get efficiencies.
Okay.
Now, and the way they've chosen to do that is by closing offices, by eliminating the ability of people to speak to officers in person, and moving on to online or to
third-party contractors.
Well, sure. In the world, that's organizations like visa application centers that are private companies like VFS Global or Pony Express and a number of other, either courier companies or what are, in some cases, glorified travel agents who've been given the job of collecting documents as contractors for the federal government. And there's no question that there's efficiencies there, although at the same time you have, you have people now engaged in the Canadian immigration process who aren't Canadian, who don't know anything about Canada necessarily. And so there's some concerns there, obviously. The efficiencies, though, have been real. And the question, I guess, for the voter is, what is your priority in terms of the immigration process? And when we start talking about the platforms of the two opposition parties,
which we will in a couple of minutes,
you will see that a lot of their attitude towards immigration is returning the budget back to immigration to give it more of a face and to try to address some of these imbalances in terms of interface between the government and people.
One of the things that we, over this near historically long campaign, will have, I would hope, a few opportunities to do as voters in our own ridings, is to attend all candidates' meetings and ask our local people what they think about the economy and this and that and the other thing. So one of the things I'm hoping that you fellows will be able to do in the course of this morning's chat is give us a few perhaps sample good questions to ask all of the candidates of all of the parties when it comes to immigration issues. It may not matter as much in Saskatchewan or New Brunswick, but here on the West Coast, the gateway to the world for Canada, certainly on the Pacific, immigration issues matter a great deal. And they don't always get discussed as widely during election campaigns as perhaps they should, and sometimes that's at the behest of the parties involved. When we come back, we'll talk about the other parties, what the Liberals and the NDP have to say about what the government's done and what they would do differently. It's The Law Show on CIL 650 with just a taste of politics on the side. Back after this.
There's more of the show still ahead. This is The Law Show on CIL 650.